Okay, let's talk about Asian corporate governance. There is a family ownership element to this governance. And we talked about this. Families own the largest businesses in interconnected cross ownership networks. I mean, the family members will not only be in management, but they're often the shareholders. They may be the majority of shareholders. They serve as directors on the board. So a lot of power in the hands of these blood relatives. This probably traces back to the Confucian ideology that puts the company as the head of the family and the workers are like the children. And it's very common in countries that started out poor and rapidly grew their economies. Because in order to grow an economy, you have to create relationships with other people. And those relationships are either going to be built upon trust. And what more trust can you get than those of a relative, a family member? Or they're going to be built on a foundation of government support through protection of property rights and an unbiased court system. The US, for example, and many of the European countries built their economies more on a government that adopted protection of property rights and an unbiased court system. Whereas in these Asian countries, you didn't have that. In fact, many of these court systems and governments are corrupt to this day, like we talked about in India and in the Philippines as just a couple of examples. So you still don't have that. So they rely on family relationships. It just happens to have traced its way all the way up to the biggest companies. And some of these companies are the largest in the world. I mean, you've got companies like Samsung and Hyundai, among others. This does mitigate the principal agent problem. Remember, the problem there is the agents are the workers, the owners are the principal, and you got to get the workers to maximize profit for the benefit of the owners, the principal. But that problem isn't there if the principals are the agents. You know, if the owners are the workers, or the top management is the parent of the kids that are in the lower management. However you slice it, the principal agent problem can be reduced through strategy, okay, or it can be reduced through familial ties. Compromises minority shareholder rights and willingness to invest. You know, it's very undesirable for somebody that's going to put a small amount of money into these companies only to have very little say on who's on the board because they're a minority shareholder, and in a company that's pretty much run by inside families for the benefit of those families, not for the maximization of profits to benefit all the shareholders. So same problem we saw with the European model, where a lack of minority shareholder rights and willingness to invest, it cuts off that supply of capital from minority shareholders. And you say, well, they're minority shareholders. They don't put that much capital. They do when you combine them. I mean, if you have an environment that's fertile for minority shareholders, you can bring in billions of dollars into a company because there's so many of these minority shareholders. Most people are going to be small-time shareholders, but en masse, they make up a large portion of capital available. So you cut that off and you don't have it, which is why a lot of these companies do rely on familial wealth to keep the company growing, because they don't have that outside investment. They also rely, of course, on banks, which is why the bank is at the center of these major conglomerates, because they're not getting that access to capital from shareholders. Let's talk about contracting. Contracting is just forming contracts to do business. Propping is the idea that financial support would be given to less profitable units of a conglomerate. This means that if you're part of the large network, even if you're not profitable, the other companies may keep you alive. And this gives a certain stability to business that otherwise wouldn't exist. Another thing that's common in the Asian model is tunneling. That is, awarding of contracts to firms or individuals inside the conglomerate. So company A might only sell its steel to company B, an automobile manufacturer, and not to outsiders. This would give the automobile manufacturers a guaranteed access to steel, and maybe even at cost pricing. So it gives an advantage to the automobile company that otherwise wouldn't exist if the steel and automobile companies were both independent and operating for profits. Relational contracting is the idea that contract is going to be based on personal relationships. And this is, again, to work around unreliable courts and corrupt legal systems. It contrasts with market contracting, which would be formal arm's length based on the rule of law. Relational contracting emerges in these poor countries that, again, don't have that foundation of property rights that more stable countries do. So you'll notice that these elements of contracting here are by design. They're a way of dealing with the challenges that the Asian countries face that may not have existed to the same extent in Europe or in the US. Let's keep going. I'm going to let you guys look at these numbers yourselves. They're detailed out pretty well in the book, and it just solidifies with actual data what we've talked about. But check those out. Let's move on to transparency. Asian model governance is less transparent. There's lower standards for publicly traded companies, almost no disclosure requirements for any transactions between related parties. In fact, as we've learned, related party transactions may be the norm among the biggest companies. So disclosing them would almost be like saying the sky is blue. Accounting statements are not commonly vetted by impartial outsiders. Again, the accounting statements may be produced with an accounting firm that is part of the conglomerate. So this makes the companies less transparent to outsiders. It means that there's less desire to invest in them by outsiders, and that limits the flow of capital, external capital, to these companies. Lower PE ratios. Asian countries seem to have lower price to earnings ratio relative to Anglo and European models. Now, just to clarify, a PE ratio is the price of a stock divided by the earnings. For example, if a stock is trading at $50 and it pays $1 a year in earnings, then that's a price to earnings ratio of 50, which in essence means that someone would have to pay $50 to get $1 of earnings. A lower PE ratio would mean that people would pay less for the same amount of earnings. So the lower the PE ratio, the less you have to pay to get $1 of earnings. And that usually is not a good sign for the companies themselves. It means that people are paying less for something that they're producing. The price discount that we see in these Asian countries is probably due to everything we've talked about so far. Family members and stakeholders are granted influence relative to minority interest shareholders. Familial inheritance of the company may limit shareholder control. In other words, shareholders may want to get rid of the current CEO and get a new one in there, but the CEO is succeeded by a family member. It's not, the succession plan, I should say, is not about shareholders. It's about familial inheritance. And poorly run companies are almost impossible to raid and replace management. Remember how we relied on the Warren Buffetts and some of those other corporate raiders to hold companies accountable, to threaten the management that if they mismanage the company, they'll come in, buy up the company, and fire the management. Well, it's almost impossible to buy out these companies because the families own them, and the families hold them for reasons other than profits. So even if the shareholders wanted to replace the management, they probably wouldn't be able to. That combines with these other factors to create a price discount, meaning people are willing to pay less for the same amount of earnings that you would see in an Anglo or European country where the price to earnings ratios are higher and you don't have these same issues. Let's keep going. Asian capital markets. Most Asian companies are funded by families and company cross-holdings. Remember, with the bank at the center, very little capital is supplied from outside minority interest shareholders, and the reliance is on debt over equity funding. It's not that they don't want equity funding, it's just they've created an environment in the model to dissuade a lot of capital from flowing in from outsiders. So they're forced to rely more on debt. Limits access to capital, increasing the risk to firm and shareholders. Again, you're dependent upon the bank. You're cutting off a form of funding that would be available to European firms and to American firms. Limits foreign investment, since the U.S. is a superior safe haven for debt investors. This is an interesting one because the safest asset in the world is still perceived to be U.S. Treasury bonds, that is, debt issued by the federal government of the U.S. That is debt. And you look at these companies in Asia that are using debt as a means of getting funding. They're relying on it, but a lot of investment flows to the US for debt, not to those Asian countries, which reduces the amount of capital available to these Asian countries. That, no coincidence, creates high domestic saving rates. The domestic saving rates help offset a lot of this lack of outside capital. Flows to banks rather than equity markets. So savers in Japan and in Korea, for example, are more likely to put their money in the bank than in stock markets. And it increases the bank influence over government and markets. Banks become critical channelers of money to the corporations and to government. So banks have a lot more power. Take a look at this data from Japan, and you'll see that across time, Japan has had a pretty high gross investment rate and a relatively high net investment rate as well. By the way, gross investment is total investment. Net investment is gross minus depreciation. So net investment is like new investment, right? Stuff that is not just invested in to replace old stuff, but actual new machines, new buildings, new infrastructure. So where do they get the money to do this? Well, very little comes from government, right? Very little comes from corporate savings. Most of it comes from households. Now you can see households are the major source of funding for investment in Japan. Right? Fits here, high domestic saving rates. By the way, to put this in perspective, we've got double-digit saving rates across time. In the U.S., we usually hover in single digits, and at times have even went down to 0%, 1%, very low. These companies in the Asian markets are highly leveraged. Their use of debt means that they always have a lot of liabilities on their balance sheet relative to equity funding. And this can create a problem because think about it. If there's a downturn in a company's business, if the company is primarily funded by shareholders, well, the shareholders take a hit, right? But they just don't get, they don't get their profits. But if there's a downturn and the company is primarily debt leveraged, then they still have to pay those principal payments. They got to pay the creditors back. They still have to pay the interest on the debt. So they still have this liability that doesn't go away or get mitigated when there is a downturn, which makes it more vulnerable to downturns in terms of viability. And this may be why you see a lot of this conglomeration, because if you're going to borrow money, you want to borrow it from somebody that's going to be part of the network, right? Or you want to have other companies that can prop you up in times of crisis. So this is problematic during periods when revenue falls, but debt costs do not. Take a look at this illustration here. Compares the U.S. household finance to Japan and breaks it down in terms of the different asset choices. You'll notice in the U.S. it's pretty much spread out evenly, whereas in Japan it's more heavily weighted towards things like cash and debt. In fact, in Japan, stock equities make up a very small slice of household savings, whereas in the U.S. it's over a quarter of savings. So it fits with what we learned in the previous slide, right? That the Japanese rely heavily on household savings and on debt over equity funding for companies. Let's talk about Asian labor markets. There's elements of both Anglo and European models here. Elements of the Anglo model are the hire and fire system, right? It's easy to hire, easy to fire. But at the same time, there tends to be more regulation and a basic rights provided to workers, like the European model. It's very paternalistic. It's expected that the company take care of the workers. They're part of the family, right? Low unionization levels, and unions are usually enterprise specific. So for example, Sony might have a union, but it's just for Sony. Whereas in the US, you have the United Auto Workers Union that would represent workers in that industry as a whole, not company specific. This likely relates again to the kind of familial backdrop of these Asian companies. You don't need high levels of unionization because the company is expected to take care of their workers, and the workers are stakeholders. But where there are unions, they're designed to represent only the workers in that particular company, that family. All right, we'll stop there and wrap up the remainder of this chapter in the next video. Thanks.